But JoAnn and I are delighted to be here tonight, and I want to thank Matthew, and I want to thank Jim Weil and all the incredible people at FRAC. I want to thank everybody in this room who's associated with the anti-hunger movement. We have accomplished a great deal this year, and it is because of the people in this room, and you all owe yourselves a round of applause for the incredible work on the Farm Bill, so thank you. We are all, JoAnn and I are honored to be here with Daniel Schorr and Roger Wilkins and George McGovern. Matthew mentioned that I'm not related to George McGovern, but I owe him my election to Congress. In 1996, when I first ran for Congress and I was greeting voters in Fall River, Massachusetts, I was standing at a street corner saying, "Hi, I'm Jim McGovern, I'm running for Congress. I'm Jim McGovern, I'm running for Congress." And this elderly woman came up to me and she put her arms around me and she looked into my eyes and she smiled and she said, "Mr. McGovern, I have to tell you, it was the proudest moment of my life when I voted for you in 1972 when you ran against Nixon." I didn't know what to say, so I said, "Thank you very much. I hope you'll vote for me again." And I won Fall River with 70% of the vote, so it worked. So thank you. An old history professor once said that the world will not get better on its own. And the older I get, the more wisdom I feel and see in those words. Nothing incredible or great or positive has happened in this country just by accident. It's when good people, like-minded people, come together and join together in a cause and fight for change, for important change, for the benefit of everybody. And these three individuals here that we're going to talk to tonight kind of epitomize that slogan. I mean, they have fought in their own ways for change, and they have made a difference, and especially in the area of combating hunger and raising awareness and encouraging action against hunger, and they've made a huge difference. And so tonight we're going to have a discussion that will not only kind of celebrate their incredible achievements, because their achievements and their contributions deserve to be celebrated, but more importantly, we want to get their advice and their insight on how to be effective, how to be more effective, how to come up with a strategy to end hunger once and for all in this country and around the world. Our goal is to end hunger. And that's what motivates all of us in this room here today. And so hopefully we can get some good insights on how to do that. So let me turn this over to JoAnn.
Thank you very much, Jim. And likewise, let me thank all of you for being here this evening and for you three gentlemen who really led the charge and made such a difference. And so we do need your advice. And I wanted to begin my questions by asking each of you what your strongest personal memory is of the ways that hunger became an important issue back in 1968, 1969. In other words, what moved you all the most on a personal level? And so, Senator, can I start with you, please?
Well, we saw a remarkable film here tonight on this 1968 CBS documentary, which was called Hunger, USA. I was then near the end of my first term in the Senate, and when I arrived home one evening, my wife Eleanor said, "George, there's a little ad here saying that CBS is doing a documentary called Hunger, USA." I had just spent a couple of years at the Kennedy White House running the Food for Peace program, which was entirely geared to hungry people abroad. And I said to Eleanor, "You know, that's strange that a network would give a whole hour to a program like that. I don't think there's much hunger in the United States. Maybe India, Pakistan, places like that, Africa, Latin America." But we decided to watch it, and three of my daughters clustered around the TV set to see it. And the thing that shook me up that night was that scene we had of that little boy who was standing around watching the other children eat while he had nothing to eat. And I'll never forget how he answered that question. What do you think when you stand here and watch the other children to eat and you can't eat. I really thought he'd say that he was angry or something like that. And when he dropped his gaze and said that he was ashamed, and the reporter asked him why, and he says, because I haven't got any money. That got hold of me in a way that I don't think I'll ever forget. And it was that scene that prompted the creation of the Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs. I went to the Senate the next day and introduced a resolution to create this new committee. And it went through without objection. It was the first time I discovered that a lot of people in the Senate of both parties don't like the thought of hungry kids. And that, of course, has been the message of FRAC, which you have carried so brilliantly over the years. In any event, we set up that committee, and it was run in a bipartisan way from the very beginning. Bob Dole, with whom I met just this morning, was the ranking Republican. I thought when he came to the Senate, he was the meanest, most partisan Republican I'd ever met. Not like you, JoAnn.
Thank you, George.
JoAnn's one of the great ones. But he mellowed over the years. He's now a law partner with Tom Daschle. And I think between Tom Daschle and me, we've really Christianized Bob Dole. Is that okay, Dan, to say Christianized here? Anyway, we civilized him, and he's been a tower of strength from that day to this. And our committee, I think first thing we did of great significance, we provided for free and reduced price school lunches, practically double the size of the school lunch program in terms of participation. We increased the food stamp program enormously. I think it's been increased maybe 50 times since we started on this in 1968. And then out of our committee came the idea for WIC, Women, Infants, and Children. Those were some of the great triumphs, and they're memorable in my mind. A lot of people, when they hear my name, they think of opposition to the Vietnam War, and that's understandable because that war became an obsession with me. It probably had something to do with my winning the Democratic presidential nomination in '72 and then losing so heavily in the fall. The country was divided right down the middle on that issue. But the thing that I've given more time to than anything else in my public life is working against hunger, either in this country or abroad. So thanks so much for the marvelous work that FRAC has done all these years. Everybody in this country is in your debt. Jim McGovern, I can't say enough good about. If you get me
That's okay, you can go ahead. We got plenty of time.
He's been just a tower of strength in the House and carrying the banner along with JoAnn Emerson. Marshall Matz, we're all indebted to him. He writes our speeches and does all kinds of, tells us what to say when we testify, so we depend on him heavily. Sorry for taking so much time.
Thank you so much. Mr. Wilkins, can we ask you to share your strongest personal memory of that time?
Did I go too long?
That time would not have struck me as powerfully.
We're going to adjust your mic here.
Just don't tell Daniel that you had to help me out.
I'm going to tell him that, there we go, how's that? How's that now?
Hello there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That better?
That time in the late 60s would not have affected me so powerfully had I not had an experience as a welfare worker in Cleveland 51 years ago, when I was 25 years old. My draft board didn't know what to do with me, and they said, we may take you and we may not, and so I had to put my life on hold, so I got a job as a welfare worker in Cleveland. And even though I'd spent most of my life in segregated circumstances, I hadn't come face to face with real hunger, or with the real contempt that so many people had for the poor. And one time, because of an error by the welfare department, a mother in my caseload did not get her check on the Christmas weekend, or was not going to get her check. And I thought that was horrible. She had about 3 kids. So I stayed, and I forced the part of the bureaucracy that could produce that check to stay long enough to check and make sure that the check was due, and it was due through no fault of hers. But I didn't get that check until, 11 o'clock at night. And so I drove out to her house. Remember, this is the time of the notorious man in the house rule. And I got there, and I was really feeling like Santa Claus, that I had achieved this. And I knocked on the door. A man answered. She came, saw me, and shrieked and cried, because she believed that I was there checking on whether she had a man in the house, when I was there only to give her this check. I gave her the check, and on the first day of work afterwards, the man came to me in my office in the middle of it was like a newsroom full of people and desks, and he got in, he came to see me, and he was crying when he started to talk to me, and he said, yes, I do love her, yes, it's against the rules, but I love her and I love those kids, and I don't usually stay, but I just brought the food for Christmas, and they would have been hungry if I hadn't brought the food. And they're hungry a lot. I said, even with the food, even with the money oh yeah. She said, oh yeah, it's not enough. The kids are always hungry. Well, by the time he finished telling me this, he was crying, I was crying. And in the little time I had left there, I tried to fight through the bureaucracy and bring about some changes that would have gotten more food in the budgets of these people, but of course it couldn't come to pass. And I think it was the most bitter failure of my life. I remember it vividly now, and I have tears in my eyes because So I will come back and talk about the late 60s, but I cannot talk about hunger without talking about how this particular American bureaucracy, the state and the local bureaucracy, cared not a whit about whether those kids were hungry or not, and whether that had anything to do with their development and the lives they would lead. It was like a whole college education in 3 days. So.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you very, very much.
Very good, Robert.
Mr. Schorr.
I came back to the United States in 1966 after 20 years as a foreign correspondent, and carved out for myself an assignment at CBS which included poverty. I found that the whole question of poverty was difficult to sell not only to the American people, but within CBS. When I proposed to do a story about welfare, what was happening in welfare, I got a reply back from a producer in New York on the Cronkite show saying, do us a story on welfare cheats. And I said, but there really is a big issue of welfare. Yeah, and it's not just the welfare cheats, it's the issue of poverty. I found myself having great difficulty rousing interest in the subject of poverty among my own colleagues, one of whom said, Dan, look, 2/3 of us in New York here come in on the train reading the Wall Street Journal, and our view of poverty is that poverty is just something that, which is exploited by people who don't want to work. I was appalled by that. And then I found, however, that as time wore on, something else happened. The issue shifted from poverty to hunger. And when the issue became hunger, it became a totally different thing for most American people and for people in Congress. I can remember that a committee of doctors went down to the Carolinas and came back and said there are people hungry, and Americans were shocked. In South Carolina, Senator Fritz Hollings, himself very conservative, got up and made a speech on the floor of the Senate and said there's hunger in South Carolina and we must do something about it. Then I began to realize that by simply switching the issue from the word poverty to the word hunger, you were appealing to something very basic in America, and that began to work. I covered the select committee headed by George McGovern. Found it interesting that he found he could do very well there with a rather conservative Republican named Bob Dole on the subject of food stamps and hunger. Why? Because Bob Dole says, in Kansas, we grow the food, you find us a market for them, and so suddenly you had brought together McGovern and Dole, which was really bringing together those who produced food and those who needed food. 1969, 1967, I went down to the Mississippi Delta with Senator Robert Kennedy. I had, with great effort, convinced CBS that I really wanted to take a camera crew with me to cover this thing, which I thought would be rather dramatic. And it was a great deal of resistance, saying, yeah, you take a crew up 2 or 3 days for what? I said, the subject is not simply poverty anymore. There are people hungry in America, and Senator Kennedy is going to have a look at that. I was there with him. I was impressed with how impressed he was and how shocked he was and how he made a discovery as he'd go into one place, a shack after another, and look around, talk to people, ask when did you have your last meal, found that some had not had a meal all day by mid-afternoon. And the picture changed. America could abide poverty, don't ask me why, but America could not abide hunger. And if you ask me what is my main impression of those years when I became re-Americanized by going out to cover these things, it really was that for America it became a question of how you presented the problem to them. And so I think today also the issue remains not simply poverty, but the blanched faces, the malnutrition look of people. And even while we talk about hunger all over the world and what should be done about it, but that America should have hunger is a sin which this country cannot abide.
Thank you very much.
I want to kind of follow up on what Mr. Schorr said, and again, I want all the panelists to respond. But something unique happened in those late 1960s where, for whatever reason, you know, people came together and action took place. And I guess, you know, I'm struck by the film that we saw earlier when it mentioned that there were 10 million people in America who are hungry. We now have 35 million Americans who are hungry. I guess my question is, you know, what was unique about that period that brought people together to take action? You mentioned that talking about hunger kind of changed the focus for a lot of Americans. Poverty they didn't react to poverty the same way they did to hunger. But obviously other things happened. What was unique about that? And you know, and it seems like we went through a period where a lot of good things happened, a lot of major things happened, and then we went through a period where not much happened. And here we are today, and we're trying to figure out a way to kind of re-energize the country and refocus Congress on concrete steps to take to end hunger once and for all. What was unique about then, and you know, what is the, you know, what might lead to a similar constellation of events now?
Who are you asking?
All three of you.
Well, let me take an initial crack on it. First of all, we should reflect upon the fact that in some parts of the country, people are celebrating the 100th anniversary of Lyndon Johnson's birth. And I think Lyndon Johnson had a lot to do with the receptivity of people to action about both poverty and about hunger. But I also think that what we had in the 60s was not simply a president who really wanted change. Johnson always used to say, I want to finish what Lincoln started. But what I really think was in his gut was he wanted to finish what Roosevelt started, because he was a Roosevelt guy, and he believed in these programs, that these programs could change people. So if you worked for him, you felt the lash at your back, because he really wanted that as his legacy. And back in the 60s, there were some people, even despite the riots of the mid to late 60s, there were some Americans who really still had a very substantial empathy for people who were pushed to the margins, poor whites, poor Chicanos, and Native Americans, as well as blacks. And the black poor had not been demonized yet, as it was to be demonized by the Reagan administration. So when King said that he wanted to lead a poor people's campaign, he was smart enough not to say this is just an extension of the civil rights movement. It was a rainbow coalition. I mean, Jesse did not make up the idea of rainbow coalition. Jesse stole it from Martin. Anyway, and he was going to bring to the mall poor white people, poor red people, poor brown people, poor black people. And they were going to say to the government of the United States, here we are, we try the best that we can, some of us work very hard, and we are still impoverished, and we want to speak to you from all points of the population and all points of the compass. And that was the dream. I worked with Martin as the government's liaison with this poor people's campaign that was coming. And so I'm not making up in my mind what he had in his mind. It's what he told me he wanted to do. And then, of course, he was killed. And the poor people's campaign fell apart, because the people on whose shoulders leadership came to rest were devastated. They were his friends, they were his followers, they were his disciples. They just didn't have the heart. So it was not of the same strength and breadth, and didn't have the intellectual drive that Martin would have brought to it. And so it was a sad and pitiful thing. But the point I want to make is Jesse never stopped. And he figured out we can turn this into a hunger thing. So he started taking people from, every day he'd take some people from this despised little poverty village down there on the mall, right where the Korean War monument is now. And he would take them to the lunchrooms in federal buildings. And they would demonstrate in the lunchrooms about being poor and hungry. And all of a sudden, these mid-level federal workers, some of whom were in agriculture and some of them were in HEW, but the people who really had to deal with poverty, all of a sudden they saw goo gobs of poverty in their faces and hungry people wanting to share their food. It was Jesse at his best. It was genius. But the other part of it is this story is quite awful. The Attorney General and I decided that we would try to get our government to give free food stamps to people who made less than $30 a month. You'd make less than $1 a day, you'd get free food stamps. Well, this was a Democratic administration. We got battered everywhere we went trying to sell that idea. And I'll tell you, the worst, we went to see Orville Freeman, then the Secretary of Agriculture. Liberal as they come, from Minnesota. And he said, no, we can't have that, because if we give them free food stamps, they'll just take those food stamps to the liquor store. I just was stunned. But we pushed, and our hero was Sarge Shriver, who came thundering in with all his exuberance and his enthusiasm, and he backed us up and got it over to the White House, and Joe Califano, who was the president's man for domestic policy, thought it was a great idea. Took it to the president, who thought it was a great idea. The president called the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Wilbur Mills, who said, no, Lyndon, we can't do that. I just got you $100 million for your war, and I don't have any more money for you. So that was the high water mark in the 60s, after all this attention that people brought to the issue, and especially the dramatic trip that Robert Kennedy took and you showed to the country. After all of that, we could not get our government to provide free food stamps for people who made less than $1 a day. And I tell you, that was the day, when they said that was the day I knew I was going to leave the government and go do something else.
To carry that story a little bit further, it was very interesting. Orville Freeman, Secretary of Agriculture, had arranged that when food stamps were distributed, that people who received them had to pay a certain amount of cash in order to get them. And when Senator Kennedy came back from that trip to the Delta, if I understand correctly, he talked Orville Freeman into changing that and making sure that food stamps went to everybody, including those who had no cash to pay for them. The history of food stamps, I think, somebody has to really write that history, because the history of food stamps is the history of America's conscience in some ways. Before food stamps, I recall they used to distribute food called surplus commodities. It would be distributed to people here and there. You come and you get them and so on. It was hit and miss. If you got them, fine. If you didn't. The whole idea of rationalizing this into a program with food stamps started somewhere during the Kennedy administration. And oddly enough, had a very interesting history in the Nixon administration. Nixon, for all his manifest faults, which we don't have to go into here, had some very interesting ways of addressing things. And he was induced to make a speech in which he promised that he would institute a food stamp program in every county of America, he promised. How that came to be was an interesting story, because there were suits being filed all over the country against the federal government for reneging on its promise of food stamps. And so there were two cases opened in two states which the government lost. And then Pat Moynihan, domestic policy advisor to President Nixon, and John Mayer, a nutritionist who works for the administration, said to Nixon, you may as well promise to institute the food stamp program because you're going to have to do it anyway with these court decisions. He said, okay, you're sure there's no other way out? And they assured him, and he took, whereupon one of the court decisions was reversed on appeal. Nixon was now in a position of having promised, and had he known that it was going to be reversed, year after year and decade after decade, the history of America's conscience is written in what happens with food stamps. And it's a remarkable history for this country.
Senator, do you want to say something nice about Nixon?
Well, I went to Nixon's funeral. And I was sitting there listening to all the eulogies, which were fine. And the thought went through my head that even from Nixon's standpoint, he would have been better off if I had won in 1972. And I agree with Daniel Schorr that Nixon signed into law a lot of good legislation. All those things that Bob Dole and I were sending down there, he signed into law without batting an eye. So you have to give him credit for that. I think Dan is right that the same people who managed to live rather comfortably beside poor people are uncomfortable about hunger in the world. That's one of the first things I learned about the Food for Peace program. It was actually, in a way, part of our foreign aid program, but you bring up foreign aid in the House or the Senate, and boy, you're going to have an army against you. If you say, we're going to take this God-given abundance and share it with hungry people abroad, it usually goes through pretty well. Roger's absolutely right about the role that leadership plays in all this. I was in the White House for a couple of years, the first 2 years of the Kennedy administration, and the very first executive order of the president on day one was to expand the amount of commodities being distributed in West Virginia. That went right back to Jack Kennedy's experiences in West Virginia during the primary election against Hubert Humphrey. He had never really seen genuinely hungry people close up. And so that became the first order of the administration. The second order of President Kennedy was to create the Food for Peace office in the White House, which I had the privilege to direct. So we had leadership then. We had the stories coming out of West Virginia. We had the CBS documentary. We had the campaign of Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. It's really sad to relate these names. They're all shot and all are gone, but not until they'd put an imprint on this necessity of feeding hungry people. You know, even the Bible commands us to feed the hungry, but when it comes to the poor, the Bible tells us you've always had the poor with you. Not that they're excusing it, but it's as though that's a permanent condition of life, whereas hunger we're commanded to end. Let me say this. We've made a lot of progress on the hunger problem, especially on food stamps. And FRAC deserves an enormous amount of the credit for that. In 1974, it fell to my lot to have something to do with handling the Farm Bill in the Senate. And I remember that when we came to the food stamps section of the Farm Bill, there was an uproar about food stamp recipients buying lobster tails and prime steaks and all this business, driving Cadillacs up to the supermarket. And there was real opposition of it to the point where a sustained effort was made to cut back on food stamps drastically to punish these cheaters that Dan made a reference to. Now, in this Farm Bill that we passed this summer, over the President's veto, 74% of all the billions in that bill go not to farmers, but to the food stamp program, 73/4 of it. And I'm not trying to butter up anybody here, but that wouldn't have been possible without the work of FRAC and your leaders and your members and friends and the people that you talk with in the Congress. So I think we need to fully exploit the anxiety that Americans have about anybody going hungry. We need to exploit that sentiment. And secondly, we need to remember Roger's recitation about what leadership can mean in bringing us to victory. Hunger is one thing we can actually beat, both in this country and the world. I came here thinking that I would give most of my efforts to world peace. I've gotten a little discouraged about that. People have been killing each other ever since Cain and Abel, probably before that, and it looks like the slaughter is going to continue. I used to tell my daughters when they'd gang up on me about the Vietnam War and why didn't I give up on speaking out against that, and I would tell them there's one good thing that can come from the Vietnam War. It's such an obvious disaster that we'll never again go down that road. Now they're after me. What about Iraq? Just as foolish, just as unnecessary. Another war against a little country that wasn't the slightest threat to the United States. We may not agree with their leadership at various times, but there was no particular threat from that source. So maybe someday, some of you here are young enough maybe to see this, we'll have peace all across the world. In the meantime, one of the building blocks of peace is to make sure everybody has enough to eat. And that's what FRAC tries to do. Congratulations.
Let me ask you all something. You know, Jim and I and several of our colleagues and Jim Weil also talked about all of the people that we've been able to get around the country to participate in the food stamp challenge and to really bring notice to the American public of the continuing challenge that this country faces to feed so many millions of people, and particularly the children. And we got good press. You know, it was good local press. And I don't know, I know Jim and I probably both got a lot of emails and people talking about it. And I actually still have a couple people every so often mention it. But I don't think that we were able to make the impact in the national news media, kind of like, I mean, back in the days when this documentary was shown on television, and it was the first real thing that hit me as a teenager growing up, because I remember watching it, and it was so powerful. But these days, we just can't seem to make the dent with the national news media and reach as many people as we need to, so that we can enlarge our army, our forces, trying to combat this problem. Do you have any insight? Obviously, things are different than they were with so many different media outlets. But do y'all have any suggestions as what we can do, not only Jim and me in Congress, but also all of these wonderful activists here, to try to raise the attention on this issue, you know, to the extent, I mean, the gas price issue has obviously made it to the national news media, but this issue hasn't, and this issue is equally, in some cases, even more primarily important to the well-being of this country. We need your help. So do you have, how can you advise us on what more we can do?
Well, I do think that leadership counts for a lot. And so, without being partisan at all in this room, if you really want some change, you think about hunger, and you look at these candidates through the lens of hunger and ask yourself, which one of these people do I believe is going to have the will to and the talent to bring
Make this important initiative.
And I also want to say something about negative leadership. There are lots of places in this country where Ronald Reagan is revered. But he and his administration made all-out attempts to smear poor people, hungry people. I mean, Reagan was the one who talked about the welfare queen in her Cadillac. Reagan was the one who said, "Doesn't it just annoy the heck out of you to see a big buck buying big T-bone steaks with food stamps?" He's saying that as if he was ever in a grocery store line, you know, and that he had seen it, and it made him mad. But his welfare Cadillac and his big buck food stamp T-bone steak thing really had the effect of diminishing any strength a hunger movement would have had. And they even, in jiggering with the food stamp program, they even came up with the idea of ketchup as a vegetable or something. I mean, it was just they would do anything. So I guess that one of the things you do, yes, you do look to see if this candidate or that candidate is somebody who's going to take us again to war. You look at all kinds of things, but if you really care about hunger, you listen for cues to how this person will not only affect government operations, but affect the way American people think about hungry people. And if Americans don't think compassionately about hungry people, we're not going to go very far.
I have not much to add to that. Let me say this, because I sense in the way the question was framed that you're putting the news media on the spot and saying
a little bit.
It's a little bit that is. And so let me say, forgive us our press passes.
But but you were successful in getting your network to spotlight this, and we don't have as much success as you did.
Let me just add to what Roger said. Let me add this. It's a lost cause trying to put pressure on the media, say your social conscience requires that you do this and that. Our news media, they occupy a small corner of a vast entertainment stage. And it is very difficult to have them take the initiative, as Charlie Kuralt and CBS did back then, in order to lay this program and these needs before the American people. However, we're in the midst of a very interesting political presidential campaign. If President Nixon could make a promise that there would be food stamp programs in every county of America, why is nobody challenging the candidates of both parties, saying, will you commit yourself, if elected, to providing necessary food stamps, necessary aid to help to abolish hunger in America? What president has recently said, if elected, I will work to abolish hunger in America? I mean, you can put the pressure on the media and we'll flinch a little bit, but you would be better served by making it, by forcing it into the minds of our political candidates.
Excellent. Thank you.
I tell you, it's not by mistake, it's not by happenstance that photographs of Robert Kennedy down in the Delta of Mississippi with his still haunted face holding hungry black children that galvanized people. That really put it right in everybody's gut, and it was a nonpartisan issue. It was humanity raw. Now, there was a good journalist along, but until you get leadership like that, you can make progress, but it's a slog up a hill.
Well, I think we need better journalists too, who are more committed to some of these issues. Wish we had more journalists like you, Dan. We're about out of time. I was just thinking of the answer to JoAnn's question about how we could have gotten more attention on the food stamp challenge. Maybe I could have done it with Angelina Jolie instead of you, and it might have gotten more attention.
And I could have done it with Brad.
Right,
yeah,
perfect. I think Jim Weil is coming up to give us the. He just gave me the eye that we have to wind this up. But I just wonder, if with the indulgence of the audience, if just each one of you could take 30 seconds to give us some words of hope about, to give us the energy and the inspiration to go on with this fight.
The words of hope is that hunger in America, the resolution of that problem, is a soluble issue. This is not a pipe dream. That's why I mentioned the more difficult task of eliminating war from the world, but hunger, both in this country and abroad, is a soluble issue. There's no real excuse why we can't score an A+ in the resolution of this issue.
We all go to a lot of dinners in Washington. And sitting in front looking back, I can tell you that in all the dinners I've been into in 25 years in Washington, I've never seen a dinner in which only 2 or 3 people left before the end of the evening. That just tells you how extraordinary this was. It's a rare experience for all of us to hear so many of our heroes
Jim,
at one time. Roger?
Could I just briefly
Absolutely.
put another answer? You can't get weary in a struggle like this. And you have to have faith in our country. Oh, shut up. And I'll tell you, I was born in a segregated hospital, in a segregated city, in a segregated state, as was my wife. Different state, different hospital. And I was born in 1932, she was born in 1942. Neither of us could have envisioned what's going on in American politics today. And we got here from back there because there were a lot of people who really believed in the values of the Constitution of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address. And they didn't give up. And they kept on going, year after year. Now, we have not arrived at the promised land yet, but damn it, we have come a long way by not quitting and keep on working.
Well, it's rare to have 5 of one's heroes on stage at the same time, and it's an incredible treat. 2 final pieces quickly. One, Senator McGovern is going to be signing one of his books after we're done with the dinner tonight in the room where we had the reception in return to donations to a family foundation to prevent alcoholism. And so this is a rare opportunity to talk to Senator McGovern and get one of his books signed by him, and I encourage everybody to take this opportunity. And then when you go home, you can get on Amazon and order all of Senator McGovern's and Roger Wilkins and Dan Schorr's books and have an incredible treat for 2, 3, 4 weeks, because reading these 3 men's books will give you a lifetime's worth of education. We have one final piece of business. Those of you who are veterans of FRAC's dinner know that we give a FRAC Achievement Award every year. Last year we gave that award, and it was richly deserved, to JoAnn Emerson and Jim McGovern, and we have the Achievement Award for these 3 gentlemen tonight. I'm not going to explain why they deserve this award, because you know it from what you've heard tonight. It's richly deserved. So to Daniel Schorr, Roger Wilkins, and George McGovern, we'll be giving you your plaques in a second. Congratulations. Thank you all from the bottom of our hearts. Please join me in thanking them and congratulating them.